solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will support and defend.
That I will support and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
I've always been very goal oriented. Right? I need something to work for. It was this, getting this degree or putting this officer package together, or now it's this job. So I'd say I honestly way over indexed on the tactical career stuff, like the interview prep, the resume prep, the job hunting. I think I was really well prepared there, especially for having worked with a lot of vets now. As an E5 getting out with limited experience, I stuck the landing on some of those topics. Where I completely missed the mark was the self-awareness. Number one, that I was burnt out and just experiencing general life stress. I was still young enough. I didn't realize that was how life worked. Oh, you have kids and job responsibilities and things. And that becomes overwhelming. And sometimes you just need to unpack it and recharge. I missed that entire window. So me saying that's where I was, that's years later. In hindsight, I think I was more nervous than I was aware of and scared. And it is, you're leaving your whole identity. I think especially guys that, like us, you either enter into an academy or into the military at 18, 19 years old. That's your identity definition window. And you don't get as much room for exploration as some young adults do. And that's not good or bad. That's part of the trade-off and part of the sacrifice. I'm not hating on it, but you don't develop that personality as much, or you don't explore as much. So, I had to do that and fill that in backwards. And I think with all that discomfort, what I was doing anyway was saying, let me just find something to be really good at. Let me check something off the list. So when you think about things like prepping for an interview or writing your resume, it gets tactical enough that you can feel like you're quote unquote good or you're ready. Whereas things like emotional well-being are much more complicated and nuanced, and you can't just oh, I won, I did it. Turns out I just Heisman'd that topic for several years and was let me get my resume really good. I was stationed in England, and the way the timeline worked, my first job, I ended up landing a job at SpaceX. That was my first civilian job.
That's sick.
Yeah, it was awesome. And they were heavily recruiting at the time for my background, like Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, aviation technicians, because turns out the standards for aircraft in the military and spacecraft aren't too far apart, and you can bring a lot of those skills. But I remember doing an interview from England
with Elon Musk.
No, yeah, not with Elon, no. But then I did my first one or two interviews with them there, and had interviewed with a couple other companies while I was over. And then I remember we came back to America, landed in Ohio, and I stayed one night, and the next morning I flew on a plane and went out to LA to finish my interviews in person with SpaceX. And I collected my first 2 or 3 checks as a civilian while I was still on terminal leave. I was really on it.
What was it like for you starting work on terminal leave? What was that like?
In hindsight, it was terrible. So I thought that I was doing the right thing, getting my job, getting pay lined up, because that's what you think. You're oh, I got to keep a paycheck and I've got to get all this figured out. I don't remember if I just wasn't talking about it or asking my wife enough, or if I just wasn't listening. It's probably that I wasn't listening. But yeah, men in their 20s for sure. I was an idiot. I was no, I need to start working, and didn't take any time off. So went from that burnt out, overworked moment in the military to SpaceX, it was an amazing opportunity, amazing environment, but a lot of hours. I was working hard. I was working on second shift. So I think shift work, aside from all the physiological impacts, now I'm leaving a wife and young baby at home, and it's not the military where you're I have to do it, or it's part of the bigger mission. You're this was my choice. And I think that was a tough moment for us as a family. I think where I got probably A's in the career transition, I damn near failed the take care of your family side of the transition and take care of yourself. The short version is you fast forward, and it seems, and I've gone through a couple different civilian employers on my path between SpaceX and where I work now, but it's every employer I would hit this point a year or two in where I was just stressed out and overwhelmed and overworked, and they don't get it. And this is whatever it is, right? You name the story of like all that negative talk of that people can do to themselves. When you do that across a couple different employers, you start to realize you're like, maybe it's me. Maybe work just has parts about it that aren't fun. No, and again, don't get me wrong. I think I left every step of my career for pretty good reasons. But as you look at the theme, you're like, oh, I was unhappy here. I was getting too emotionally invested in work here. I was wrapping my identity up in it too much at all these places. You're like, maybe that's something I can look at controlling. And I think, again, this kind of only came clear in hindsight, but when we talk about that identity gap of you didn't get to figure yourself out as a young adult, the military kind of tells you who you are. And it's not a job the same way being a civilian is. It's part of who you are. And I think I was trying to replace that and be like, no, I'm like, who I am is where I work. And that's just not the way it is. There are very few jobs. And there are, I think, certain medical professionals, and if you're the founder of a company, that's a lot more of who you are than the average employee. But when you're living in corporate America, that shouldn't be your entire identity. This is probably controversial advice in our community, but I quit drinking about 2 years after I left the military full time. And I think that was honestly I said I've made a couple of good decisions. That was definitely one of them. And for me, I know there are people that do different levels of how do you quit and only drink beer or whatever. For me, it was just easier to abstain completely. So I haven't drank since 17. And that was a huge decision. And I remember early on, it wasn't a vet, but another guy was like, how do you function if you don't drink? I'm like, in hindsight, that's a problem. But like, bro, you shouldn't be asking that question. But the answer I gave was one of those first like self-aware moments where I was like, look, when you're not drinking, you have to look at yourself clearly in the mirror every day. So like whatever stuff starts to show up that you're like, oh, like I feel uncomfortable about, there's something in the corner over there. Maybe I haven't learned how to identify it, but now I've got one less layer I can use to block it out. Like I'm not drinking. So it's like, oh, that's creeping into view a little bit more. Eventually I'm going to decide to go clean that mess up in the corner.
When you are talking to people or within your personal experience, how do you deal with the imposter syndrome of I don't fit here or I'm not capable of doing X, like those thoughts?
Oh, man. It's funny. I literally posted, I don't know when this will end up airing, but like 2 days ago, I actually posted something about imposter syndrome on LinkedIn. And it was like military transition day 3000, whatever. Imposter syndrome still a thing. I'm beginning to think it's part of being a human being. And I think that, again, I had this moment of realization where, I got out of the military and I wanted to be, I didn't know exactly how to describe it, but I wanted to be like an executive or a leader within business, right? I wanted to be one of the movers and shakers and all that. Number one, as you get back there, you realize that it's not as glamorous as you thought it would be. I love what I do, but it's different than you think it is from the outside looking in. But I remember I first became a director and it was like, I made it, right? I got the title and I'm everything I wanted to be. And I was so excited. And then as you start working with other people, you realize that like everybody's still human. Like they're not like, I work with some incredibly brilliant people. All humans are prone to mistakes and biases and gaps in their logic. And like people are human. That was really empowering. And I wish I could go back in time and show Joel 10 years ago, hey, you're still a human with this title that you think is more important or fancier. Right. So that's, as far as I can tell, imposter syndrome just exists for everybody. And the quicker you can just acknowledge it again as a part of your human experience, right? Just like anger, just like fear, just like envy, all of these things are just, they are. You don't have to attach meaning to it. You can just notice like, oh, I'm going on a podcast. Do I really belong on a podcast? You can just say like, oh, that's how you feel. I don't need to address that right now. Like that can just sit there. That's just a thing. Two other things on that confidence, imposter syndrome thing. Number one, find people that'll cheer for you or root for you. Again, I said I made a couple good decisions, one of which was marrying my wife. That was something like multiple times I remember looking at jobs online and I'm like, oh, this would be great, but I don't know if I could do it. And I think that even happened like with this job where I came into Optum. I was like, God, I don't have this and I've never done that. And like, I don't know if I have enough time in this. And she was like, are you kidding me? She's like, do you understand how good you are? And like that, sometimes that's just like your husband or your wife or whoever, like that person, like pumping you up, but like just somebody to be like, dude, push the button, go for it. Oh yeah. Okay. And then the other thing, there's a ton of physiological stuff that you can learn when it comes to public speaking, dealing with emotions, whatever it is. Your brain produces, it only has a couple chemicals, right? Whether you're doing a public speaking engagement or you are about to get in a car accident or you're in like war, your brain has the same option of chemicals to produce. So a lot of times, like, it's more just learning how to handle those responses. So there's plenty of cool stuff out there about doing the Superman pose before you go into an interview. And I've done all that and I really love it. My favorite one is to listen to stand-up comedy before every interview. 100% of the time I listen to stand-up comedy before I do interviews. So you go in loose and conversational.
If you could talk to yourself, what would you have told yourself to do differently in your transition around the identity piece?
I think the biggest examples I share is understand your personality and understand your values. And at first, everybody wants to think that like their values are whatever the military value, like courage and leadership. Like leadership is actually not a value for me. It's something I do in my day job, and it's something it's a skill I need to use, but it's not the most important thing to me. Like having the courage to go through and do that. So there's a couple of there's one called like the VIA Character Institute that has a bunch of different characters. Travis Manion Foundation uses that same kind of template of a value exercise. You could always do Myers-Briggs, right? Which is like the 16 personalities. Investing in that work and really getting curious about like, how am I wired is so powerful. And I really wish I would have gone through with more of that 10 years ago. And then the other thing is like, take your damn terminal leave. Take your terminal leave. Take the R&R. Take a breather. Recover. You've earned it. It's okay. Like, you deserve to rest.
Hey, everybody. I really hope that you liked this supercut of the Post-Military Podcast. If you did and you want to see more, I would recommend that you check out the whole episode, which is here on YouTube and also on multiple different podcasting platforms. If you like this and you want to support the channel, I would ask that you give the video a like, subscribe, and share the content with those who might need to hear it. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.